Hello YouTube. Today we're going to look at dreaming. The question that I'm interested in here is simply, what is it like to dream? Dreaming is something that we all experience, probably every night, but today we're going to see that perhaps we know rather less about dreaming than we might think. A number of philosophers and psychologists have suggested that maybe dreams are really nothing like what we think they are when we reflect on them in waking life. So, we usually think of dreams as involving experiences that we undergo while we are asleep. And when we wake up, we remember those experiences in basically the order that they happened. So we might say that the orthodox standard view of dreaming involves kind of three claims. First, that dreams are experiences, and second, that they're like sensory hallucinations, and third, that when we wake up, our memories of dreams are basically accurate. So one challenge to this kind of view is presented by Dennett in his article Are Dreams Experiences? Dennett proposes a different theory of dreams, which he calls the cassette theory. According to this theory, dreaming has two stages. First, there is a composition process, where the brain unconsciously, so while you're asleep, there's no experience or anything, but the brain kind of writes a dream narrative. And second, there's a memory loading process which occurs as you wake up, where the dream narrative is loaded into your memory, like a cassette being loaded into a cassette player. So when you wake up, you have a dream narrative in your memory, and you think that you experienced a dream. But actually, that's a false memory. You didn't experience anything while you were asleep. A purely unconscious process in your brain created a story and then loaded that story into your memory, which you now think you remember having experienced, but you didn't. What's interesting about this view is that it's actually simpler than the standard view of dreaming. So on the sort of standard view of dreaming, where dreams involve experiences, there must be three things going on. First, there must be a composition process where a dream story is created. Secondly, there must be some process whereby that story is put into our memory. And finally, there must be a process where the composition is consciously experienced, where the composition of the dream story is consciously experienced. That's what distinguishes the standard view from Dennett's cassette theory. So Dennett's cassette theory simply jettisons the idea that there is conscious experience, basically. According to Dennett, a dream story is created and the dream story is put into our memory, but there's just no experience of that. Whereas on the usual view of dreaming, well, there's still a dream story, that story must still be put into our memory, but there's also a conscious experience. So, arguably then, Dennett's view is actually simpler, and maybe that would be a reason to favour it. If we look at it from the point of view of Occam's razor, the simplest theory is to be preferred. So that might be one reason to favour Dennett's theory. Dennett goes a bit further. He also suggests that maybe the dream that is composed during the night might not be the one that is loaded into your memory when you wake up. So he suggests, it could be the case that the brain has a sort of library of dream narratives ready to load into your memory. An interesting example relevant to this are suspense dreams, and these are dreams that seem to involve a clear narrative structure that builds to a particular event. Sometimes the event in question is linked to events in the real world. For a famous example, the physicist Alfred Maury described a dream in which he was taking part in the French Revolution. Towards the end, he was forcibly taken to the guillotine, and just as the blade came down, he woke up in a jolt to find that the headboard of his bed had just fallen off and landed on his neck. So it seems clear that this dream was caused by the headboard falling. The dream was caused by the stimulus that woke him up. But on the standard view of dreaming, that's very difficult to explain, because the dream had a narrative structure building up to the guillotining. It was the French Revolution, then he was taken to the guillotine, felt afraid and so on, and then the blade came down. So the guillotining was the hallucination, as it were, or the experience of the guillotining was clearly caused by the fall of the headboard, which instantly woke Maury up. So it looks like all the standard view of dreaming can say about this is that it must just be a coincidence. Dennett's cassette theory, on the other hand, can explain this kind of case, because he can say that the fall of the headboard caused a relevant dream narrative which had been pre-composed beforehand to be uploaded into Maury's memory. So, obviously, I'm not sure how common these suspense dreams are. I'm not sure I've ever had a dream quite like this. So it could just be coincidence. But if they happen more than would be expected by coincidence, then we would need to explain them, and Dennett's theory does provide a way of doing that. Now, I should note that Dennett doesn't claim that his theory is true. The point that he's making is simply that the evidence that we have doesn't decide between the standard theory and the cassette theory, and for that reason we should be sceptical of the standard theory. Basically, we need to be able to draw a distinction between actually remembering an event and merely seeming to remember an event. But when we remember dreams, that doesn't do that. There's no distinction between actually remembering a dream and merely seeming to remember a dream. Dennett's point is that what we seem to remember when we wake up can be explained by many different theories, and we don't need to make the assumption that dreams are actually experiences. It could be the case that we're just completely unconscious during sleep, and as we wake up, a pre-composed narrative is slotted into our memory. That could be the case. That's Dennett's point. So he advises that we should be a bit more sceptical about in our thinking about dreams. So is there any way to challenge Dennett's skepticism? Well, one response appeals to the empirical research on sleep and dreaming. Traditionally, we distinguish two broad types of sleep. There is rapid eye movement, or REM sleep, and there is non-rapid eye movement, or non-REM sleep. Actually, there are a few different kinds of non-REM sleep, but that doesn't really matter here. Dreams appear to be much more common during REM sleep. There are sometimes non-REM dreams, but REM dreams tend to involve clear, coherent narratives, often with a lot of emotional intensity, whereas non-REM dreams are repetitive. They have vague and confused narratives. They have very little emotional content. So although dreaming can occur in both types of sleep, it seems to be much more heavily associated with REM sleep. At least the rich, complex narratives that can be distinctive of dreams generally only seem to occur during REM sleep. Sleep is usually studied using electroencephalograms, or EEGs, and these record electrical activity in the brain. Non-REM sleep is characterized by slow waves with a high voltage on the EEG. REM sleep is characterized by high frequency waves with a low voltage on the EEG, and that's similar to what we find on EEGs during wakefulness. Here's a diagram showing EEG recordings for different stages of sleep. Wakefulness and REM sleep are both here at the top. This is actually chronologically out of order, since REM sleep is the last of these 5 sleep stages. So stage 1 here is the transition to sleep, as you're nodding off, and that's quite similar to wakefulness in some ways, but it's characterized by what are known as theta rhythms. Then we progress into increasingly deep sleep. Stage 4 is the deepest sleep stage. Again, as you can see, it's high voltage, very low frequency waves. And then REM sleep comes after stage 4. After the deepest stage of sleep, there's suddenly much more activity. The eyes start moving all over the place. That's why it's called rapid eye movement sleep. And as you can see, REM sleep is quite similar on the EEG to wakefulness. It has high frequency, low amplitude, and these beta rhythms. REM sleep is also characterized by increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, and increased respiration. there's a general bodily arousal as well as extra activity in the brain. So from the EEG readings and the bodily profile, we seem to have a state of alertness during REM sleep. And so initially then, it looks like the physiological evidence suggests that dreams are experiences, because we know that dreams occur mostly in REM sleep, and the evidence suggests that REM sleep involves a state of alertness. So that's just what we would expect if dreams were genuine experiences. Unfortunately, this is a little bit too quick. After all, REM sleep isn't exactly the same as wakefulness. There are also many differences in brain activation. That's to be expected, of course, given that dreams are very different from waking states. The differences in brain activation during REM sleep presumably track the lack of rationality and the lack of agency that we have during dreams. So maybe those brain differences also track a lack of consciousness during dreams. Basically, my point is that whatever the similarities between wakefulness and REM sleep, we know that there are also differences, and one of those differences might be a lack of consciousness. Brain evidence can only establish that we are conscious during REM sleep if we know exactly what consciousness looks like in the brain, and we can show that REM sleep exhibits this, but we don't yet know how to identify consciousness based solely on brain states. So, it's not really clear that we can use this evidence to show that dreams are experiences. Bear in mind, it's not surprising that REM sleep would be similar to wakefulness on Dennett's theory, since the process of composing a dream narrative is likely to increase brain activity. So, from Dennett's point of view, the EEG findings are really not a surprise. Another challenge to Dennett's theory comes from eye movements. There is evidence that eye movements track what occurs in dreams. A number of studies have found, for example, that if a person's eyes move up and down consistently during REM sleep, then when they wake up, they might report something like dreaming of bouncing a ball up and down. Or if their eyes move from side to side, they will report dreaming of playing tennis or whatever. The classic studies on this were by Dennett and Kleitman in the 1950s. In a further study by Lawrence Jacobs and colleagues titled "Are the Eye Movements of Dreaming Sleep Related to the Visual Images of the Dreams?", they report a sleeper whose eyes were positioned downward, then the eyes made two abrupt upward and downward arch movements, then they woke the sleeper up immediately after this and asked, "What was the last thing you dreamed of?" The subject reported that he was looking at a girl kneeling on the floor, who then suddenly did two somersaults. It's worth pointing out, though, that the connection between eye movements and imagery is far from perfect. In fact, in most cases, eye movements don't track imagery. In the Jacobs study, they report that only 18% of awakenings, only in 18% of those can the eye movements be connected with imagery. For example, in one case, a man exhibited a series of abrupt vertical eye movements. They woke him with a buzzer, and he reported that the last thing he dreamed was intently reading a blackboard from right to left. Still, there are a higher than chance number of cases where eye movements connect to dream imagery, and sometimes it connects in very precise ways, as with the girl doing the somersaults. The eyes move as though the person was really experiencing the imagery. So what can Dennett say about this? Well, I think that, again, he has a pretty plausible response. We can hold that the eye movements are just reflecting the non-conscious process of narrative composition rather than conscious experience. If your brain is non-consciously composing a narrative involving bouncing a ball up and down, why shouldn't it produce vertical eye movements as an artifact? It's not really clear why that shouldn't happen. So eye movements could just be a kind of epiphenomenon of that non-conscious narrative process, rather than being a case of sort of tracking images that are actually experienced. Another challenge to Dennett's theory is posed by lucid dreaming. This is a phenomenon in which a person becomes aware that she is dreaming. In some cases, she's actually able to control her body and move about the dream world. She can go flying or rob a bank or have sex with all her favourite celebrities. I've actually had lucid dreams a few times, although I usually couldn't control my body in them. and I woke up after only a few seconds. So I was not able to live out my fantasies in any lucid dreams, but they do happen. I know they're not common, but certainly a lot of people will experience cases where they come to be aware that they are dreaming. And this looks like a problem for Dennett, because in a lucid dream, you're aware that you're dreaming. So pretty obviously that must be an experience. It can't be a false memory if you're aware and experiencing it. Similarly, it can't be a non-conscious process of narrative composition, because you're actually conscious. You're conscious and you're aware. However, at least initially, I think Dennett has another plausible response here. Consider, for example, a novel in which a character discovers that she is fictional. We can imagine somebody writing a novel in which a character discovers that she is a character in a novel. Perhaps lucid dreaming is like this. In the dream narrative, you discover that you're dreaming, but it's just a narrative and it's loaded into your memory when you wake up. You think you remember realising that you were dreaming and then controlling your body and living out your fantasies, but this didn't really happen. Similarly, the fact that in a novel a character discovers that she's fictional, that doesn't entail that any person has actually discovered that she's fictional. So just because you have a dream narrative in which you realise you're dreaming, that doesn't mean that you actually did do that. It could just be another false memory. So again, that's initially, I think, a plausible response, but further evidence from lucid dreaming concerning eye movements, I think, poses some bigger problems here. So I've mentioned that eye movements often track what's going on in dreams. The psychologist Stephen LaBerge had people who were very skilled at lucid dreaming learn special patterns of eye movements to communicate things. So the pattern left, left, right, right might be used to signal, I am aware, I have become lucid. And it was found that people in lucid dreams were able to give this signal. In a further experiment, for example, LaBerge asked them to give the signal, then count to 10 seconds, then give the signal again. And again, dreamers were able to perform this task, and the time between the signals was about 10 seconds. So people were able to perform tasks, and by using eye movements, we are actually able to communicate through lucid dreams. And different types of eye movements we might use different patterns of eye movements to communicate different things. And then when you wake up, you can say, well, I tried to communicate X or Y or Z, and then you can match that to what the eye movements were doing. So that looks like surely they really are experiencing things. So I mean, can Dennett respond? Well, it might be suggested that the eye movements are just automatic. Things that you do or experience in waking life are often copied into dreams, so why not eye movements? In that case, the eye movement wouldn't really demonstrate conscious awareness. But the problem with this move is that the eye movements correlate very consistently with lucid dream reports. If the eye movements were just automatic, surely we would expect them to occur in non-lucid dreams as well. And furthermore, people who can do this appear to exhibit a certain degree of sort of control and agency. Like when LaBerge told people, okay, give the eye signal, count to 10, give the eye signal again, that was again something that they were able to do. That exhibits a degree of control that we don't usually have in dreams. So, I'm not really... So that does, I think, pose some problems for Dennett's view. Perhaps a more plausible response is simply that lucid dreaming doesn't really tell us anything about normal dreaming. There is evidence that lucid dreaming involves quite different brain processes from normal dreaming, and perhaps should be seen as a kind of third state between wakefulness and normal dreaming. This is described in the article Lucid Dreaming, a State of Consciousness with Features of Both Waking and Non-Lucid Dreaming by Ursula Voss and colleagues. For example, lucid dreaming involves activation in the prefrontal and front polar brain regions, which tend to be quiet even during REM sleep. EEG results show substantial differences between lucid and non-lucid dreaming as well. So it's unclear whether conclusions drawn from lucid dreams can be generalised to all dreams. So maybe that would provide some scope for Dennett to resist this problem, but I think the case of lucid dreaming, I think it pretty conclusively at this point shows that we, at least sometimes, really do have experiences when we are asleep. But, maybe I think it's pretty clear that in at least some cases we can have experiences while we sleep. And if lucid dreams are real experiences, then of course that raises the question of, well, why not normal dreams? Why propose a completely different mechanism for normal dreams? So an interesting point that may be worth considering, which maybe represents something of a compromise between Dennett's view and the standard view, is, can we lack consciousness while awake? A famous example is provided by the phenomenon of highway hypnosis. Highway hypnosis is something that occurs in countries that have very long, straight roads. We don't get these kinds of roads very much in the UK, but they're common in the US. These really long roads through the desert that just go in a straight line. When people drive down these roads, they can enter a state like hypnosis, or perhaps a trance state, where they completely tune out and their driving becomes automatic. They might drive many miles, and they can operate the vehicle safely, and yet they seem to have no conscious awareness of what they're doing. What highway hypnosis suggests is that there might be such a thing as awareness or experience without full consciousness. So you can be attuned to the world in some sense without actually being conscious of it. Maybe. I mean, I'm not saying that that is how we should interpret highway hypnosis, but that's at least a plausible view of what's going on in highway hypnosis. There is a kind of subconscious awareness. So there's awareness or experience without consciousness. Now notice that dreams are actually quite like highway hypnosis in two ways. First, in both cases we operate on autopilot. When you're dreaming, there's no critical thinking, there's no reflection. Things happen and you respond to them in a completely automatic way. Same is true for highway hypnosis. Second, there's very poor memory of each. When you wake up from a dream, memory of the dream is rapidly lost. When a truck driver finally comes back to awareness after a hypnotic state, he'll often find that he has no recollection of the last 5, 10, 15 minutes. So maybe this suggests another theory of dreams. And so we might say, look, dreams involve three things, right? So there's the composition process where the dream is written, where the dream narrative is created. There's the memory loading process where that narrative is stored in the memory. And finally, the composition process is experienced in some sense, but it isn't consciously experienced. You are aware of it, but you're not consciously aware of it. So this is basically the standard view of dreams, except that rather than claiming that dreams are consciously experienced, we say that there's instead a kind of unconscious awareness. And so that's maybe a compromise between Dennett's skepticism and the standard view. And notice that evidence against Dennett's cassette theory really doesn't apply to this theory. So the EEG and bodily profile of REM sleep suggests awareness because dreamers really are aware. They're just not consciously aware. The eye movements track what's happening in dreams for the same reason. Dreamers are aware of various things going on in their dreams and their eye movements track it, but they're not consciously aware of it. And finally, lucid dreams can be understood as a type of dream where the awareness becomes conscious awareness. And so, you wouldn't generalize lucid dreams to all dreams. So maybe this is a sort of skeptical view where dreams are experiences, but there's a kind of lesser consciousness involved, or perhaps you're not actually conscious when it's going on, but there is still perhaps we could say that the brain creates a narrative, and it registers this narrative. Some part of the brain registers that this narrative is going on, but it's not conscious experience. Maybe that's a view. If we can lack consciousness while we are awake, then perhaps we can say that dream states are the same sort of thing. Right, so, okay, that's one way to challenge the idea that we have conscious experiences while we sleep. Another challenge to standard views of dreaming is presented by Jonathan Ichikawa in his article Dreaming and Imagination. So let's remind ourselves of what the standard view of dreaming says. First, it claims that dreams are experiences, and this is what Dennett challenges. But second, it assumes that dreams involve misleading or hallucinatory sensory experiences. Dreams involve experiences of the sort that we have during waking life. In other words, when you look at an apple in a dream, the sensory experience that you have is pretty much the same as if you were looking at a real apple. Dreams are a kind of virtual reality experience. Ichikawa calls these kinds of experiences percepts. So when you look at a real apple, you have a percept of an apple. And when you hallucinate an apple, you have a percept of an apple. The standard view of dreaming says that dreams are constructed out of percepts. Unlike Dennett, Ichikawa grants that dreams involve experiences of a sort, but he thinks they're not percepts. Dreams are not like sensory hallucinations. Rather, dreams are constructed of mental imagery. And Ichikawa says of mental imagery, and I quote, "Visual imagery is the kind of experience one undergoes when imagining what something looks like. Compare seeing or hallucinating an apple to imagining an apple. Imagining an apple is similar in certain respects to seeing an apple, but there are also obvious differences. Imagery is a sort of mere simulation of perception. And the same is true for imagery of other modalities: auditory imagery, gustatory imagery, tactile imagery. Compare feeling velvet with merely imagining feeling velvet. The mental image is a kind of diminished or simulated version of the perceptual image." Now, the exact nature of mental imagery is heavily contested. I think standardly we would think of imagery as, in some literal sense, being pictures in the head. Presumably auditory imagery would be sounds in the head, and olfactory imagery would be smells in the head, and so on. This is controversial. Zenon Pilishin has provided some significant arguments against this view, if you're interested in this question. But what is unquestionable is that visual imagery does involve many of the same processing systems as visual experience. For instance, if you're asked to imagine an apple, you'll produce many of the same eye movements you would make if you were examining a real apple, or a hallucinatory apple. So the fact that dreams involve eye movements and that dreams involve activation in certain visual centres of the brain is compatible with holding that it's merely visual imagery rather than outright hallucination. So why would we think that dreams are created of imagery rather than being hallucinations? Well, first, Ichikawa points out that dreams don't wake us up. Suppose a loud sound occurs in the real world while we sleep. My alarm clock rings. This wakes me up. It does this by causing a certain auditory percept. I hear the alarm. I have a perception of the alarm, and that's what wakes me up. Now let's say I hear an alarm in a dream. This usually doesn't wake me up. You can dream very loud sounds and stay sound asleep. Now, according to the standard view, the dream alarm causes exactly the same kind of auditory experience as the real alarm. So why doesn't the dream alarm wake me up? Ichikawa thinks that the difference arises because the dream alarm is merely is really a piece of auditory imagery. It's not an auditory percept, and only the auditory percept would wake you up. Of course, I think Ichikawa makes some pretty questionable assumptions here. In particular, he seems to be assuming that when we're awoken by a real alarm, what happens is that the alarm first causes a certain auditory experience, an auditory percept, and this percept is what causes me to wake up. So if I have a similar percept in a dream, that should wake me up as well. But I don't see any reason to accept this assumption. Perhaps what wakes me up isn't the percept, but some other process caused by the alarm. Obviously, a real alarm is going to cause very different processes in the brain than a dream alarm. So in particular, a real alarm is going to make the eardrum vibrate, whereas a hallucinated alarm won't do that. And the waking could be just a mechanical process. right? So the eardrums vibrate very hard, and this initiates a kind of immediate bodily arousal response. So the eardrums vibrate, that sends a signal to a particular part of the brain which initiates a bodily arousal. And also the vibration sends a signal which also creates an auditory percept. But as far as the bodily arousal is concerned, the conscious perception of the alarm is epiphenomenal. So that would explain why the dream alarm doesn't wake me up, but the real alarm does do. So I don't really find this first argument all that convincing. Second, Ichikawa appeals to psychological evidence found by David Fulks, described in Fulks' book Children's Dreaming and the Development of Consciousness. Fulks claims that dreaming develops quite late in childhood, around the same age that capacities for manipulating mental imagery develop. Of course, young children and even some animals seem to have dreams, but they are very simple and they occur far less frequently than dreaming in older children and adults. I mean, by older children, I'm talking 5, 6. I mean, not 10 or 11. Obviously, kids have dreams, but the point is that dreaming isn't sort of common from the start. Dreaming only really gets going around the same age that the capacities for creating and manipulating mental imagery emerge. Furthermore, Fulks has found that performance on mental imagery tasks correlates positively with the complexity and frequency of dreams. These kinds of tests might show you a shape and ask you to manipulate the shape in the mind. So, for example, if you look at these images of the number 5, which of these 5s are backwards? Obviously, this first one is backwards. But to work out which of the other 3 are backwards, we need to mentally rotate them. You need to sort of kind of rotate them in your head. So you kind of turn that one rotate that one clockwise, and you can see that 5 is the right way round. Now, people who do better on these kind of mental imagery tests have more sophisticated dreams, which suggests that there's a significant connection between dreaming and mental imagery. Third, Ichikawa appeals to neurological evidence. Here he draws on the work of Mark Solms and Oliver Turnbull in their book The Brain and the Inner World. There are 3 zones involved in visual processing. First, there is the primary visual cortex, which is connected directly to the retina. Damage to the primary visual cortex causes blindness. However, it doesn't prevent the subject from generating mental imagery, nor does it have any effect on dreaming. The second zone in visual processing are the many areas involved with specialised processing. That's colour and motion processing, object and face recognition, and so on. Damage to this zone causes specialised visual problems, such as prosopagnosia, which is the inability to recognise faces. So if you've got a damage to the face recognition area, then you won't be able to recognise faces anymore. But again, visual imagery and dreaming remains intact. The third zone is the occipito-temporal parietal junction, and this handles the higher level abstract visual imagery. Damage to this zone obviously compromises visual imagery, and it compromises the ability to engage in certain kinds of reasoning. But it also, at least according to Solms and Turnbull, it also eliminates dreaming. So the point is that the brain areas associated with dreaming appear to be the same as those areas associated with constructing visual imagery. Destroying a person's ability to generate visual imagery will thereby destroy their capacity to dream. So as far as the brain physiology is concerned, it looks like dreaming is quite strongly connected to visual imagery. Of course, you can still hallucinate in these cases. Just because you can't manipulate visual imagery, you can still have hallucinations. So destroying the ability to manipulate visual imagery, that destroys dreaming. It doesn't destroy hallucination. And so that would suggest that there is a perhaps constitutive connection between dreams and visual imagery. Another argument, which Ichikawa doesn't mention, but which might be suggestive, is that hallucinations are very rare, at least in daily life, whereas mental imagery is commonplace. if you think about everyday circumstances, sensory impressions, sensory hallucinations that fail to match anything going on in the world happen only in very special cases. They don't really happen. I mean, certainly not the kinds of very complex hallucinations that you would associate with dreaming. I mean, maybe if you're tired, you might sort of see things, kind of flashes of light or things being distorted or whatever. But if we think about the kinds of hallucinations you get in dreams, where you will, the sorts of hallucinations we think we get in dreams, you might have a dream of a person, right, of a whole person. You don't hallucinate an entire person in normal circumstances, and so that raises the question of how exactly are outright hallucinations generated during sleep. But if dreams are just standard mental images, then we can see dreaming as an instance of just a more familiar phenomenon, because we construct mental imagery all the time, sometimes intentionally, sometimes they drift into our minds unintentionally. I can just sort of have, maybe I'm staring into space and I have the mental imagery of a person come into my mind. So Ichikawa's view can explain dreaming as just another manifestation of a perfectly standard process. So that's all I wanted to talk about today. In the next video we will consider some objections to Ichikawa's view, and we'll also look at some skeptical accounts of dream recall, dream memories. But that's all for now. So thanks for watching. Goodbye.